Shvi Shel Pesach, we commemorate one of the greatest nisim, one of the greatest miracles of all time, Kriyas Yamsuf. The great nace of Kriyas Yamsuf, the splitting of the sea, Mitzrayim, chasing after Bnei Yisrael miraculously being saved, and the Mitzrayim being destroyed. Chazal tell us that Godol Yoiser Bizos Hayam, the Biza of the Yam, the wealth that the Bnei Yisrael obtained after the Kriyas Yamsuf, was greater than even the wealth that they took out of Mitzrayim. So that begs the question, if they had so much wealth at Kriyas Yamsuf, why did they need to have the wealth coming out of Mitzrayim? If they had so much wealth coming out of Mitzrayim, why did they need all that wealth at Kriyas Yamsuf? And as we mentioned before, was this really a good thing for Bnei Yisrael? Was it really so beneficial for them? Was it so good for them that they had this enormous wealth suddenly coming from Avdus, from the depths of slavery, from the tachlus of anius and dachkos and the shibud of Mitzrayim, from the oppression of Mitzrayim, coming from that lowest level, and suddenly this enormous, fantastic wealth, was that a good thing for them? Shortly after, right after Ma'amad Har Sinai, also Lamilhei Zov, they made the Egel HaZov, and Moshe Rabbeinu says, the Medrash says, that Ata Garamta Lahem, you caused it. You gave them all this wealth, so they were chayta, they sinned. So what was the purpose of it? The Torah says, Vahi b'shalach, when Bnei Yisrael were sent out of Mitzrayim, v'leinocham derech eretz plishtim, they were not led the short way, the direct way, derech eretz plishtim, ki koravhu, pen yinocham amaroisim milchama v'shal Mitzrayim. There was a fear that Bnei Yisrael, when they were confronted with the war, they would turn back to Egypt, they would go back to Mitzrayim. So they went in a circuitous route. They had a detour, they took a detour. They didn't go the direct route. And we find throughout the travels in the Midbar that Bnei Yisrael, from time to time, they express a desire to go back to Mitzrayim, to go back to the Sir HaBasar, to the good life in Mitzrayim, which is something which is incredible. It's amazing. It's a pella. What do you mean? They were the slave of Mitzrayim. Let's go back to Mitzrayim. They'll go back to Mitzrayim. Why do they go back to Mitzrayim? Mitzrayim will kill them. Will destroy them. What was that taiva, that Yetzer Hara, that desire to return to Mitzrayim, that they would have this pull, this desire to go back to Mitzrayim? Why was that a concern? Why was it a concern? If they're running away, then the first thing that they would do is just keep running and go away. Why would they go back to Mitzrayim, go back to that shibud, go back to that torture, that horrible, terrible life? The Ramban asks a kasha. He asks that there was this concern that they would be confronted with a war and they would go back to Mitzrayim. So what happened? There was Kriyas Yamsuf. They passed through, they had this great nace, and what happened immediately after? Amalek came and attacked them, so they had the war anyway. They were confronted with Amalek. They were confronted with a war. So why was this such a concern right now, that if they were confronted with a war, they'd be afraid, they'd go back to Mitzrayim, they had the great nace of Kriyas Yamsuf, they crossed the Yamsuf, and immediately they were confronted with Amalek, and they had a war. So they were confronted with a war anyway. So why was this such an issue? Another question is that it says Vayashovu lifnei piachiros, that Bnei Yisrael were turned back to Bnei piachiros. They were instructed to go backwards. Now this instruction to go backwards was one of the reasons that Parah chased after them. They saw Nevuchim Heim, they were lost. Nevuchim Heim, they were lost. So that encouraged Parah and the Mitzrayim to chase after them. So what is really going on here? They didn't go derech eretz plishtim because they might be confronted with it. Well, they took a detour, and It's as if the Ribbono Shel Olam brought about and instigated the Mitzrim, Paro and the Mitzrim, to chase after them, to go run after them, because he told them to go backwards, to Piachires. So it's as if the Ribbono Shel Olam really encouraged Paro and the Mitzrim and brought about this whole scenario. Wasn't the idea to save them from the confrontation, to save them from the Milcham, to save them from the fear of the war? The Rambam in Avos, in Perek Hey, says that the great nace of Kriyas Yamsuf, that was created, it was woven into the Bria Mishesh Yismei Bereishis. That was something that was woven into the fabric of Bria right from inception. That was a nace that had to be. Why was that so? Why was Kriyas Yamsuf, why was that such an integral part of the Bria and of the building and the creation of Am Yisrael? As we discussed before, there were different levels of the Geula. There was Me'avdus L'Cherus, there was Meshibud L'Geula. But there was also a level, and we see in the Haggadah, and we give thanks and Shevach and Hoidot to the Ribbono Shel Olam that Hashem, the Ribbono Shel Olam, took us out of Mitzrayim, not only Avdus L'Cheres, not only Meshibud L'Geula, but Me'afela L'Or Gadol, from the Afela, from the darkness to the Or Gadol, to this great light. What are these different levels of the redemption? And as we mentioned before, there was the redemption, the freedom of the oppression, of the hard work, of the back-breaking hard work, the oppression. That was one level. But Bnei Yisrael were avodim in Mitzrayim. They were avodim, they were slaves. And a slave who is a real slave, and the true meaning of a slave, lost his identity. His identity is that of the slave of his master. He is subordinate to his master. He is there to serve his master. He's there to, at his beck and call. He has no identity. Whatever he acquires, Mashakana Eved, Kana Rabbi. He has no independence. He has no independent thought. He has no independent ideas. He can't acquire anything. Even his children belong to his master. Bnei Yisrael are avodim. But now they were being taken out of Mitzrayim, which means not only that they didn't have to work hard. It means not only that they didn't have to work for somebody else. It means not only that they were able to relax and take it easy. More fundamentally, it meant that they had to be broken from the bondage, the shibud, the subordination to Para and Mitzrayim. They had to achieve their independence to become the Am Hashem. So they were taken out of Mitzrayim. They saw the Nisim. They started to be Mekayim Mitzvahs, Dam Pesach, Dam Milo. They went out with a measure of wealth, showing them, demonstrating that they are a free people, they're an independent people. But nevertheless, they still retain the vestiges of bondage. And they could not break free completely from being subordinate to be meshubed to Paro and Mitzrayim. And that's a phenomenon that exists of people who are oppressed. It's a phenomenon that exists from people who are abused. There are well-known studies that people who are in an abusive relationship, who are severely abused, even when they're given the opportunity to leave that relationship, they cannot tear themselves free They're attached to that relationship and they can't leave. They can't leave. They don't have their independence. Bnei Yisrael were mishuborim to Para Mitzrayim. Didn't mean just that they worked hard. It didn't mean just that they had back-breaking labor. Their work that they had in Mitzrayim was to denigrate them, to make them, lower them into people who had no identity, who are appendages of Para and Mitzrayim. Their back-breaking work was meaningless work. It had no purpose. Pisam v'ramses, misraces, the buildings collapsed. They had no sense of pride in what they did. They had no sense of purpose in what they did. They were lowered. They had this demeaning, degrading, meaningless, mindless work, all to destroy them, to destroy their sense of worth, their sense of purpose, their identity. And now they had to be given identity. Because lest they would see a milchama v'shavu Mitzrayim. Is it rational? Is it rational to return to Egypt, to the place of their bondage, to the place of their suffering? No. It's not rational at all. But an oppressed people, an abused person, doesn't act rationally in that regard. It was not rational. But it was not the siba, it was not the reason why the Ribbono Shel Olam took them in this circuitous detour route. It was a siman. It was a siman. It showed us the fact that they had that nitiyah, that they were capable of desiring to return to Mitzrayim after all was said and done, after all those years, 210 years of bondage, and of all the great nisim, and coming out of Mitzrayim, the fact that they were capable of returning to Mitzrayim if they see the milchama and go back to Mitzrayim was a siman. It demonstrated, it showed that they still had the vestiges of Avdus, that they were still meshubed, that they did not have their true independence. They still had not attained their true independence. They were still meshubed to Mitzrayim. That's not the reason of the detour. That's not the reason Lo Nacham Derech Eretz Plishtim. It's the siman. The fact that they were capable of returning to Mitzrayim, that they had desires to return to Mitzrayim, showed that they were still avodim. So the Ribbono Shel Olam had to bring about this great miracle to show the world that He was the Ribbono Shel Olam, to show Klal Yisrael that He is the Ribbono Shel Olam, He's the master of the universe, in total control of the universe, and to destroy Parai and Mitzrayim, the strongest, greatest nation on earth, to destroy them in front of Bnei Yisrael, as Bnei Yisrael are crossing through the Yam and are being saved, to see their masters being destroyed in front of them, to take all of their wealth and all of their riches and see their enemies vanquished. And that would instill in them the Yamun and the Ribbono Shel Olam and make them free and be able and be capable of serving Hashem. Yes, there was a Melchama after Kriyas Yam, so there was a Molech. But at that time, after Paro and Mitzrayim were destroyed in front of their eyes, they were already free people. So therefore, they did not have that concern about the Melchama of Amalek. Yes, the Ribbono Shel Olam brought this whole thing about. And he encouraged and enticed Paro and Mitzrayim to run after Bnei Yisrael. He brought them back. He told them to turn backwards, to confuse Paro, and to entice him to run after Bnei Yisrael. He brought it about because it was necessary. It was a nace that was woven in creation from Sheshimei Breishis, because this was vital and necessary to demonstrate to the world, to demonstrate to Bnei Yisrael that the Ribbono Shel Olam is the ultimate master in control of the universe and capable of nisim that are beyond our comprehension, beyond any human comprehension. And he had to destroy Para with their might and glory, in all of their glory, with their wealth, running after Bnei Yisrael to destroy them in front of their eyes and be able to overcome them, to vanquish them, and to take their wealth and their riches. And now they were free. Yes, during the course of the Midbar, Bnei Yisrael from time to time said, let's go back to Mitzrayim. We remember the Sir HaBasar, we remember the food that we had, Chinam in Mitzrayim, but primarily that was the Erev Rav. That was the Erev Rav. But Bnei Yisrael were free people. And they were able and capable of overcoming that netiya, that desire. They were no longer an abused nation. They were the Am Hashem, and capable of being Makabel the Torah. And now, after Kriyas Yamsuf, they attained a new level. One might ask, why all the Nisim in Mitzrayim, why didn't they say Shira? All the incredible Nisim, the Makas B'chayras, all the they didn't say Shira. Kriyas Yamsuf, they said Shira. Yes, Kriyas Yamsuf was the greatest miracle. But all these miracles in Mitzrayim, so many miracles upon Nisim, they didn't say Shira. Why? Now, it's true, they said Hallel when they came out, but they didn't say Shira. What is this level of Shira? We say Shira by Kriyas Yamsuf, there's Shira. They didn't say Shira, perhaps the pshat is because prior to Kriyas Yamsuf, they weren't B'nai Chayrin. They didn't have the capability of saying Shira because they were still Meshubet to Par in Mitzrayim. After Kriyas Yamsuf, they attained that level. Ra Shev Chalayam Mashal Ra Yecheskel Ben Buzi, they attained that level. Why did they have this level of Nevuah, this great lofty Madrega Dafka now? Because now not only they witnessed this miracle, but they became free. And that is the level of Me'afela Le'or Godol. They had the different levels of coming out of Mitzrayim. They had Me'avdus L'cheres. They didn't have to work hard. They didn't have to back-breaking work. They came out of Mitzrayim. They left Mitzrayim. They were no longer told what to do. But now they became B'nai Chayr in the true sense, Me'afela Le'or Godol. They became free of Mitzrayim, free of their influence, free of that shibud, and they were able and capable of saying Shira. Be meshuved to the Rebbeinu Shalom. And that's a lesson for all of us as we try to go from Madrega to Madrega. Freedom doesn't come suddenly, immediately. Even in Mitzrayim, where the Rebbeinu Shalom took us out, suddenly Me'avdas L'cheres, but it went in Madregas. And in our Avodas Hashem, as we try to free ourselves from the influences around us, from our limitations, from what ties us down, and try to grow and go higher and higher and higher, it involves Madregas, from level to level and step to step, but ultimately, to break loose from the Shibudim, to be Meshubah